On August 10, 2023, in the quiet town of Woking, Surrey, England, the unthinkable happened. Sara Sharif, just 10 years old, was found dead in her home, a place that should have been her refuge. The discovery of her lifeless body shattered the community's peace, revealing a horrifying reality hidden behind closed doors. Sara's death was not just a tragic accident but a harrowing testament to prolonged abuse. Her small, fragile frame bore the marks of violence and neglect, scars that told a story of pain and betrayal. Sara was remembered by those who knew her as a bright, curious child with an infectious smile. She loved exploring the world around her and brought joy to those fortunate enough to be in her presence. But behind the cheerful exterior was a life filled with silence and suffering, carefully concealed from the outside world. This was not just the loss of an innocent life, it was a wake-up call, exposing the cracks in a system meant to protect the vulnerable. As investigators delved deeper into the case, they unearthed chilling details. Sara had endured months, perhaps years, of relentless abuse. The signs had been there: fractures, bruises, and other injuries, but they were either overlooked or ignored. Her isolation from friends and extended family further enabled her abusers to operate without scrutiny, creating a perfect storm of neglect and violence. The more the police uncovered, the darker the picture became, leaving many to question how such cruelty could go unnoticed for so long. The investigation quickly turned its focus on those closest to Sara: her father, Irfan Sharif, his partner, Baynash Batul, and Irfan's brother, Faisal Malik. Within hours of Sara's death, they had fled the UK for Pakistan, a move that raised suspicion and intensified the quest for justice. Their abrupt disappearance wasn't just an evasion of accountability, it was a betrayal of trust that outraged a grieving community. The flight of the suspects marked the beginning of an international manhunt, further complicating an already heart-wrenching case. With every passing day, more revelations came to light, each more shocking than the last. The pain Sara endured, the systems that failed her, and the lengths her alleged abusers went to avoid justice created a story that was as complex as it was devastating. Her death became more than just a local tragedy, it was a stark reminder of the dangers of silence and the cost of inaction, leaving the world to grapple with how to ensure such horrors are never repeated. The investigation into Sara Sharif's death revealed a haunting timeline of events, each detail peeling back the layers of a life filled with hidden torment. Neighbors spoke of unsettling noises, shouts, cries, and disturbances that hinted at trouble within the household. Yet, the cries for help remained unanswered, lost in the quiet apathy of a community unwilling to confront the shadows behind the walls. Teachers and extended family, too, noticed subtle signs, changes in Sara and behavior, unexplained injuries, but no one pieced together the grim reality of her suffering. What made the case even more chilling was the systemic failure to protect Sara. Reports later indicated that concerns had been raised with social services, but these warnings were either dismissed or insufficiently acted upon. The cracks in the child protection system became glaringly apparent, as opportunities to intervene and save Sara slipped through the fingers of those tasked with her safety. Her abusers, emboldened by the lack of scrutiny, continued their reign of terror unchecked. The escape of the suspects to Pakistan added another layer of complexity. It wasn't just the swiftness of their departure that alarmed authorities, but also the planning and coordination it implied. Irfan Sharif and his accomplices had left behind not just a crime scene but a trail of questions and outrage. Their departure was an act of cowardice, leaving Sara and body as a silent witness to the horrors she endured. As they sought refuge across borders, the international community watched, horrified and demanding justice. Each revelation was met with growing public outrage. How could a child so full of potential and life have been failed so completely? The tragedy was not just Sara's death but the collective failure to protect her. Her story became a painful reminder of the unseen suffering that can exist within a home and the devastating consequences of ignoring the signs. While the hunt for the suspects intensified, so did the calls for accountability, not just for the perpetrators but for the systems that had allowed her suffering to persist. As the search for Irfan Sharif, Baynash Batul, and Faisal Malik continued, the global spotlight on the case only grew sharper. The suspects, now fugitives, had vanished into the labyrinthine streets and remote villages of Pakistan, making their capture a formidable task. Despite their attempts to evade justice, the weight of international scrutiny pressured both Pakistani and UK authorities to act decisively. Behind the scenes, diplomatic discussions and intelligence efforts were ramped up to locate the suspects and secure their extradition. Meanwhile, the community in Woking struggled to come to terms with the loss. Sarah's classmates, teachers, and neighbors were left grappling with guilt and sorrow, haunted by the signs they had missed. Candlelight vigils were held in her memory, with tearful tributes and heartfelt speeches echoing the same question: how could this have happened? The vigils were not just moments of mourning but acts of collective reckoning, forcing society to confront its failure to protect one of its most vulnerable members. Media coverage of the case also became relentless, with every new detail sending shockwaves across the globe. The narrative wasn't just about Sarah's death but about the systemic cracks that allowed such horrors to fester unnoticed. Experts debated the effectiveness of child welfare systems, pointing out the chronic underfunding, lack of coordination, and missed opportunities that had left children like Sarah vulnerable. Advocacy groups seized the moment, urging governments to prioritize reforms that could prevent another tragedy. For investigators, the case became a race against time. With each passing day, the fear grew that the suspects might slip further into obscurity or manipulate the legal systems of their host country to avoid extradition. Public pressure intensified, and activists began demanding accountability not just from the perpetrators but from the authorities tasked with bringing them to justice. It was no longer just about Sarah's case, it had become a symbol of the fight for every child suffering in silence. Sara Sharif's story, one of the most heartbreaking cases in recent memory, left the world in shock, forcing us to reflect on the systems that should have protected her but failed miserably. Her death was not just a tragic event, it was the culmination of years of suffering that went unnoticed by many. The events leading up to her tragic demise unfolded like a twisted narrative, but it was in the aftermath, with the arrests and the trial, that the true horrors came to light. As Sarah's story became more widely known, it sparked intense public outrage and an outcry for justice. The details of her abuse and the heartless actions of those entrusted with her care painted a chilling portrait of a life robbed of joy and innocence. But beyond the anger and grief, Sarah's death forced us to confront uncomfortable truths. It exposed the vulnerabilities of children in our society, the failures of the institutions meant to protect them, and the desperate need for reform. It was revealed during the investigation that Sarah had suffered horrific physical abuse for an extended period of time. Her father, Irfan Sharif, and his partner, Baynash Batul, along with Irfan's brother, Faisal Malik, were implicated in the abuse that led to her death. Though the full extent of the cruelty Sarah endured became clearer as the investigation progressed, it was during the trial that the details began to unravel. What the world learned was disturbing. Sarah's death was not a sudden tragedy, it was the result of months, even years, of physical torment and emotional neglect. According to the post-mortem examination, Sarah had sustained injuries consistent with severe abuse. Her fragile body bore numerous signs of trauma, including bruises, fractures, and other signs of repeated violence. The nature of her injuries indicated that this was not a single act of violence, but a prolonged pattern of cruelty. Sarah's death, which initially seemed like a sad but isolated tragedy, grew into something far more sinister. Her father, Irfan Sharif, along with his partner and brother, had not only failed to protect her, they were the ones who inflicted the pain. And when it became clear that their roles in her death were undeniable, they fled the country, attempting to evade justice by escaping to Pakistan. This flight was not just an act of cowardice, it was an attempt to hide the truth. It was a desperate attempt to avoid accountability for their actions, knowing full well the consequences of what they had done. But their escape only added another layer of complexity to the case, turning it into an international manhunt that captivated the attention of the world. The pursuit of justice took on an even greater urgency, as Sarah's story became a symbol of everything wrong with the systems designed to protect children from harm. In the weeks that followed Sarah's death, more details emerged, painting a grim picture of her life. Neighbors recalled hearing disturbing sounds from the Sharif household, loud arguments, cries for help, and the sounds of someone in pain. Yet, despite these signs, no one had intervened. It was as if Sarah's suffering was invisible to those around her. The isolation she experienced only deepened the tragedy. She was cut off from the world, from the support of friends, family, and even teachers who could have offered help. It was clear that she had been trapped in a situation where no one noticed the depth of her despair, or worse, chose not to act. The escape of the suspects added another layer of complexity to the case. As they fled to Pakistan, they believed they could evade justice. But the public's outrage, combined with international pressure, kept the story alive. The pursuit of the Sharif family became a mission not just for law enforcement, but for anyone who believed in the importance of justice. It was clear that their actions couldn't go unpunished, and the world was watching. Eventually, Sara's story made its way to the courtroom. The trial was a difficult and emotional journey. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with emotion. Every detail that emerged painted a clearer picture of the suffering Sara had endured. The prosecution laid out their case meticulously, showing how Sara had been neglected, abused, and ultimately killed by those who should have loved and protected her. But it wasn't just the prosecution's evidence that hit hard, it was the faces of those who had failed Sara, the witnesses who couldn't explain why they hadn't acted sooner, and the knowledge that Sara had been let down by everyone around her. The trial reached its climax with a chilling confession from Irfan Sharif in November 2024. In a shocking moment, he admitted to killing his daughter. His words sent a wave of shock and disbelief through the courtroom. This admission was a devastating confirmation of the brutality Sara had suffered at the hands of the people she trusted the most. But even in the face of this confession, there were questions about how this could have happened, why no one had stopped it, and why it had gone on for so long without anyone stepping in to save her. In December 2024, the trial ended with guilty verdicts for Irfan Sharif and Baynash Batul. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment for their roles in Sara's death. Faisal Malik, while implicated, was given a lesser sentence, as there wasn't enough evidence to show that he had directly participated in the physical abuse. However, his complicity in failing to act and stop the abuse was still a significant factor in the public's view of the case. Her death, and the subsequent fight for justice, laid bare the importance of community vigilance. It showed us the critical role that neighbors, teachers, and even strangers can play in the lives of children. It reminded us that silence is often the enabler of abuse, and that we all have a responsibility to speak up when we see something wrong. Sara Sharif's story has left an indelible mark on the world. Through her memory, the fight for justice, and the work of advocates and activists, we can ensure that her legacy lives on, not just as a symbol of the past, but as a call to action for a safer future for every child.